information, but misinformation. You never really know whether the information you're using or getting access to is accurate, right? So what you have now is you have a typical network search satisfies approach where you have to anticipate, you kind of counteract, you have to organize. And this is what you're going to be doing in the game. You'll be working together. One country will contact another country. Or a representative from one country will contact another representative from another country, right? And you're going to say, okay, if we do this, what may another country do? Okay? So you basically are engaged with anticipatory, you employ anticipatory tactics or counteractive tactics, okay? Now, so, another thing that kind of is discussed in chapter, in the chapter 6 about decision making, which is important, is that you can't ignore the fact that even though everyone is trying to do what's in their own, you're assuming that the country will do what's in its interest, whenever you're dealing with foreign policy making, there's always interests within the country that are competing with each other. And those interests tend to kind of emerge within the bureaucracy, within the civil service that is tasked with helping the administration formulate and implement its foreign policy. And that's basically talked about bureaucratic politics. Okay? In other words, is that the kinds of issues that lead to competition in the political process tend to emerge within the bureaucracy. Let me give you an example. There was this very famous, I mean, maybe it wasn't famous, but I remember this movie. You guys probably weren't, you guys were born in the 90s, right? You weren't around yet, okay. You guys know who Margaret Thatcher is? All right, okay, well, she was Prime Minister of Britain. She took on the labor unions. She was a conservative, and she was one, they called her what? Iron Lady. Who said dragon? Iron Lady, right? Okay. She was pretty tough. Let me restate. She was portrayed. I have no idea, but she was portrayed in the media as being pretty tough, right? So what happened was she went after the labor unions, and so there was a lot of backlash within the different groups within Britain, particularly the more socialist-oriented individuals, because she was essentially transforming the country and moving the country away from all the different. There was a lot of regulation, a tremendous amount of support for the labor unions, and they were very upset. So what happened was there was a movie that came out by BBC that talked about what, or conceptualized the possibility of a prime minister that was a socialist, that replaced the conservative prime minister. Okay, so here you have someone who was basically a conservative, very market-oriented person being replaced by someone who was a socialist, right? So the first couple of minutes of the movie, you have the new prime minister. He's basically driven to Downing Street. He walks into the door and he says, "Okay, Mr. Prime Minister, I would like to introduce you to your staff. And this is the staff that served, okay, the previous Prime Minister." Right? It's with me so far? So he goes and he begins to shake their hands. And what you have is you have the first person, second, third, fourth, and they're leading to to a stairway, a circular stairway that is spiraling up into the to the next floor, to the next floor. And what they did was they created this image where the stairway was like going into infinity, meaning you had all these people lined up along the stairway, that the Prime Minister started to shake at the bottom, and as he looks up, he sees these faces going up where? Into infinity. In other words, these are the same people that worked for the previous person, and now they're the ones that are working for the new Prime Minister. My point is this, is that these people go from administration to administration. And with that, you have this kind of reality of bureaucratic politics. What does change is that the new Prime Minister will listen to some, and they ignore the input from the others, right? So there's this kind of competition of trying to get your position heard within the process, okay? So typically what you have is you have this kind of notion of bureaucratic politics, where we assume that each individual, even within the bureaucracy, is motivated by what? Their self-interest. They're motivated by the ideological convictions. And then they play that game of trying to get their issues to the forefront and on the table of the decision maker. But one of the, now, this groupthink concept, you guys know, anybody took psychology here? Groupthink. They talk about groupthink in there?
Yeah, a little bit.
Do you guys know what groupthink, all right, I'll give you an example of groupthink. You guys were born after the collapse of the USSR, right? Okay, leading up to the collapse of the USSR, when Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika, okay, glasnost was this attempt to kind of open up the Soviet Union to let people have access to information. Perestroika were basically sets of rules that were trying to maybe begin to kind of change the system and help it actually deal with the challenges of the late 20th century. And what happened was that when they provided access to the people of the Soviet Union, they realized what? That their life sucked relative to the rest of the world. Because prior to that, under the communist state, the only people that really knew what was going on in other parts of the world were who? The artists and the athletes. And they got to go travel. But they had to sign a contract with the state, which was, you don't tell anybody about what it's like, you don't try to escape, and you'll have a better life than everybody else. Okay? So when everybody realized that life was not what it was, or it was inferior to the rest of the world, they began to have some problems. So now you have the Bush administration, Bush #1, his father, is in the White House, and his decision makers, and they're trying to figure out what's happening. Okay? And they're interpreting. And what happened was, if you took a look at the Bush administration's decision-making team, they all pretty much agreed on everything, leading to groupthink. In other words, they kind of like everyone in that group didn't disagree with each other, so they began to see a reality that they wanted to see, right? They began to act like a group rather than individuals trying to kind of give different critical interpretation of what's going on. And what happened was you had, at that time, two competing groups, or two different visions of what was going on. You had the Bush administration, who basically saw Gorbachev as George Washington. All right, and that is someone who is trying to keep the Union together. Okay? Or Abraham, or let's say, I'm sorry, saw Gorbachev as Abraham Lincoln, someone who's trying to keep the Union together, to keep the North and the South from splitting, right? So the Bush administration saw or viewed Gorbachev as Abraham Lincoln. The CIA, okay, viewed Gorbachev as basically obsolete. And have you guys ever remember reading about Boris Yeltsin? You guys don't know what Boris Yeltsin is? He was the first president of Russia after the collapse of the USSR. Right, guys? Oh my goodness. Boris Yeltsin. Okay, Boris Yeltsin. They viewed Boris Yeltsin as George Washington trying to establish a new country. Okay? The CIA and those that supported that vision were isolated from or frozen out of the Bush administration. And in the end, the Bush administration was wrong. The CIA and all the other groups that embraced this Washington metaphor, or analogy I should say, were right. Groupthink is if you surround yourself around people that all agree, you stop thinking critically and you begin thinking as a group. Got it? Guys with me on that? Okay, so that's bureaucratic politics. So again, this is all of the different things that I've talked about, kind of mapped out and kind of together in a very simple matrix. Okay, capacity, factors affecting leadership capacity. Okay, so we've talked about global conditions, we've talked about internal conditions. Let's finish up talking about leadership issues. Well, it all depends on your personality. We're talking about the leader of a country, Barack Obama. Is he different than George Bush? President Obama is different than George Bush. Well, personality-wise, he's different. But frankly speaking, maybe foreign policy, and as it appears now, is very similar, right? But by and large, their personalities are different. Degree of control over foreign policy. Now we have a distinction here. For those of you who, during the previous Bush administration, the Vice President of the United States had a tremendous impact on foreign policy. Okay, much more of an impact than the current Vice President had. Someone wanted to ask a question, did I hear? Someone?
I
Yeah.
was going to say their ideology is different.
Well, ideology, when we're talking about foreign policy,
Not for personality.
well, the personality, we're not talking about ideology, your way about you, okay? For example, President Jimmy Carter, okay, his personality was such that he needed to know what was going on with everything around him. When he received his briefs to read at night, he read it from beginning to end, okay? George Bush, they say, would basically read the executive summary, okay? President Clinton was just as aggressive as President Jimmy Carter, okay? Barack Obama tends to be also someone who very kind of hands-on, tries to understand. He doesn't, they delegate responsibility, but they still are very active in terms of their attempt to understand the situation. Okay, that leads to your personality, right? If you're a micromanager versus if you like to delegate, right? These are all personality characteristics. Degree of control over foreign policy means is how much do you pretty much control what's happening, or do you allow other people the space to make decisions for you? Okay. Sense of political efficacy. All right. Amount of available information. Do you guys know what efficacy means? It's how efficient, how effective you are. Okay. In other words, your approach to your commitment to efficiency and effectiveness. Ability to deal with a crisis. Some people are better crisis managers than others. Okay, and that's very, very important. If you're someone who, and I know this is kind of I'm digressing here, does anybody in here have a family member who organizes their cans in alphabetical order? Do you know what that means? What's that?
OCD.
What's that OCD stand for?
OCD is like disorders.
No, that's OCD is what's the O stand for?
Obsessive
Yeah,
compulsive.
OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. All right. Now there's various degrees of obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Someone likes to have her phone here on a regular basis. So if you take the phone and you put it over here, someone who has a small case of OCD, let's see if she moves it back. Okay? Huh?
I will.
All right, so you have, but it gets worse when you get older. I'm talking from experience. I have little touches of it as well. Okay? But we're not talking about that. We're talking about someone who organizes their cans or their cereal boxes in alphabetical order. Okay? Now, can that person deal with the crisis much easier than someone who's got everything cluttered up, but knows where everything is? Well, I'm using a very oversimplified example to tell you that people deal with crises differently. And some people are very good at it, and some are very effective, while others are very ineffective. Okay? So the kind of person you have at the helm affects their ability to deal with this situation. Great person versus spirit of the times debate. All right? Now, what does that mean to you guys? When that statement, great person versus spirit of the times debate. What does it mean to you guys? I should put it back. All right. What you should have held off a little bit, and then waited about a couple of minutes, and then put it back, and then put it back. All right. Okay. What does this mean to you guys? A great person versus the zeitgeist. Now you guys know in German, If it's I after E, you pronounce the I.